The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Maass is the greatest writing book you probably haven't read. It's not unheard of. I mean, it's got 2,500 reviews on Goodreads, but you compare that to Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, which has 100,000, or Stephen King's On Writing, which has 300,000, and you'll realize this book is criminally underrated. In this book, Donald Maass argues that most writers fail to connect with readers because they're focusing on the wrong questions. It's not about showing versus telling. Really, writers should be doing both showing and telling. And it's not about the quality of the writing. Donald Maass says that even terribly written books can still make him cry, while beautifully written books sometimes leave him very cold and emotionless. It's not even about plot or twists or hooks or tension. And it's not even about characters, even though characters are the thing that readers remember best, and they're probably the closest answer to the question. This is what Donald Maass says is the answer for how writers can really, truly connect with their readers. You must get your readers to go on emotional journeys of their own. Emotion isn't extra. It is the very heart of what you're trying to do in fiction. So let's forget about everything you learned about fiction and try to rebuild from the bottom up, remembering that you're trying to get readers to feel something. So we're going to start with the 3 ways to get readers to feel something in your story. And here is number 1, inner mode. Inner mode is when you relay what the characters are feeling in such an effective way that it makes the reader feel that too. Essentially, this is telling the reader something. You are telling the reader the character feels sad or feels happy. Let's look at an example from Normal People, written by Sally Rooney, which I actually think is her best novel. She had been sad before, after the film, but now she was happy. It was in Connell's power to make her happy. So this character is speaking very directly about her emotions. I was sad, and now I feel happy. So I will say that this probably isn't the best way to make readers feel something. And I also will say that this is the mode that beginning writers tend to use more often, because it's very easy to simply tell what the character is feeling. But that said, I think there are very good reasons to use this mode whether you're a beginning writer or a very experienced writer. The second way to make your reader feel something is the outer mode. This is when you provoke feeling in the reader by showing the character doing some sort of external act. Of course, that external act is showing their internal state, right? What they're actually feeling. Think about John Wick. After his car has been stolen, after his house has been burned down, after his dog has been murdered, and he takes this sledgehammer and goes to town on the floor in his basement and gets out this cache of guns. We don't get dialogue from him. We don't have him telling us how he feels, but we know the rage he must feel in this moment. Now, I think the outer mode is the best mode of creating emotions in the reader, and I also think it's probably the most frequently used mode as well. If in doubt, use the outer mode, it's gonna work for you. And if you're wondering how to use the outer mode most effectively, here's a little trick that you should use. Pick a point in your story where your character is feeling something really strongly, and then go ahead and write down a list of those emotions. Maybe it's just one emotion, maybe it's a couple of emotions. And then across from that list, I want you to write down actions that would reflect that particular emotion. What can your character do externally to show what they are feeling internally? Now, Donald Maass says that the third mode for showing emotion is other mode. This one's a very tricky one, because what you have to do is you have to make the reader feel something that the character actually isn't feeling. I think of a story like Life is Beautiful, where the main character is very happy-go-lucky and upbeat, but it's set during the Holocaust and World War II and the atrocities. And so what the viewer or the reader is feeling is completely at odds with what the character is feeling. This is probably the most advanced mode. It is the hardest to pull off, and it's probably the one that's used the least out of these 3 modes. Oh, and by the way, if you want to pick up a copy of The Emotional Craft of Fiction, I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can get your own copy. So now you know the 3 ways to get emotion into your fiction, but there are some common pitfalls that you can fall into. Here are 3 problems that you should definitely avoid in your writing, and we're going to start with number 1, a lack of intimacy. In the second chapter of his book, Donald Maass talks about why intimacy is so important. To create emotions in the reader, you really have to have the character sort of tear their chest open and be vulnerable and be open. And he calls this the spill the beans moment, when they're just really vulnerable with the reader. And this would probably fall under the inner mode, because it's the character being very honest and vulnerable and telling the reader, what they feel. Let's look at The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Hazel might play coy with the love interest Gus, but she does not play coy with the reader. Check out this excerpt of what she tells us. I liked Augustus Waters. I really liked him. I liked the way his story ended with someone else. I liked his voice. I liked that he took existentially fraught free throws. I liked that he was a tenured professor in the department of slightly crooked smiles, with a dual appointment in the department of having a voice that made my skin feel more like skin. And I liked that he had 2 names. It's so honest, it's so vulnerable, it's so straightforward, it's so direct. Have your character think and communicate to the reader raw, unfiltered emotions, because this creates a type of intimacy between the character and the reader will feel more likely to reciprocate with emotions of their own. A second pitfall that Donald Maass identifies is avoid mono emotions. Some writers have a tendency to become hyper-focused upon a single emotion. If you're writing horror, it might be emotion like fear. If you're writing romance, it might be an emotion like love. But consider this, in our everyday lives, we often feel a couple dozen emotions every single day. And so you don't want to flatten that whole host of emotions out to a singular mono emotion. It makes the character seem fake. Now, to avoid that, what this book says is you need to work on bringing up a whole host of what he calls small emotions. Things like contentment, things like boredom, things like melancholy. And really, you're focusing on all those small emotions not only to make the character feel more real, but also as a way to prepare the reader for when the big emotions come along. Now, a third mistake that Donald Maass identifies is focusing on negative emotions. I think most writers intuitively sense that it is much easier to write negative emotions. Things like fear and anger and depression, these are very dramatic emotions. It's very easy to depict the events that happen when you feel this emotion. But the trouble is, if you really only focus on those negative emotions, you're missing a whole side of the spectrum of positive emotions. Think about acts like forgiveness and self-sacrifice and radical acts of kindness. From Katniss Everdeen volunteering to be the tribute and take her sister's place, to the Hubermans hiding a Jewish man in their basement in The Book Thief. You want to make sure you are not only pounding the drumbeat of negative emotion, negative emotion, negative emotion. You want to give readers a chance to take a breather and see some really positive emotions that their character is feeling and feel some really positive emotions themselves. Okay, so now you know the 3 ways to create emotions. Now you know 3 mistakes that you should definitely avoid at all costs. And now we're going to go on to 5 strategies that you can use to help get more emotion into your book. Number 1 is absolutely key, and it is the emotional plot. So Donald Maass says to stop plotting based on external realities and start plotting based on emotional realities. Let's look at the public external stakes of a movie like Die Hard, where you have terrorists who have taken over the Nakatomi Plaza on Christmas Eve, because it's a Christmas movie, obviously, and they're holding everyone hostage. But what are the personal or more emotional stakes in this movie? You have this great internal motivation from John McClane. You have all this emotional tension between him and his estranged wife. Is he proving himself to her in some way? His vigilantism and his disregard for authority, is that one of his strengths or is it a weakness of his? There's a whole emotional arc of his storytelling which is mirroring the external plot. To write more emotionally, make sure your characters are fueled or powered by some sort of internal angst, something that they need to prove to themselves. As Donald Maass says, treat plot events as emotional opportunities. The second strategy to make sure your readers feel something is the emotional hook. When writers think about beginning their book, they often think of terms of a plot hook, right? What is the idea that starts the plot and gets the reader immediately invested in the storyline? But what Donald Maass points out is that you also need an emotional hook. Look at the first lines of The Stranger by Albert Camus. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure. Yes, we're getting the inciting incident like, oh, his mother died, but we're also getting this weird emotional friction like, why is he so cavalier and nonchalant about his mother's death, not even knowing when she died? It makes us wonder about his emotional state. It makes us wonder about the relationship between him and his mother. Or look at the emotional hook in Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead. This is a book about the OxyContin crisis, and the book opens with a drugged out mother who is giving birth on the floor of a bathroom. And while she is unconscious, completely hopped up on drugs, the baby comes out and is born on this bathroom floor. As readers, we immediately feel this huge amount of pity for this poor baby born to this drug-addled mom. And that is in the second paragraph. So it's definitely working as this emotional hook to get us immediately involved in the OxyContin crisis. The third emotional strategy is to keep readers on the roller coaster. This is mainly about emotional pacing and making sure you're creating a variety of emotional ups and downs throughout your story. Before you have something good happen in your story, have something terrible happen. And before you have something terrible happen in your story, have something very good happen. Basically, a zigzag up and down throughout your story is much more effective for the reader than having 4 things in a row of really good things and then 4 terrible things happening in a row. It is the contrast of negative and positive things that you have happening in your book that make the reader feel things even more intensely. For example, in George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, we have the Red Wedding. So everything is going swimmingly. We have someone who's happily pregnant, everyone is celebrating and seeming to mend political fences, and then one of the most shocking massacres ever. Another example is in The Lion King, where you have young Simba at the top of his game. He is roaring, he is learning how to be a true king, and then immediately after that is when his father Mufasa dies while trying to save him in the gorge. A fourth strategy when coming up with ways to make your readers feel emotions is trying emotional mapping. So there are limitations to traditional outlining. I don't know whether you're an outliner or whether you're more of a pantser, but when you have a list of bullet points that communicates the plot, but doesn't necessarily communicate the underlying emotional realities. So Maass suggests that instead you should try an emotional mapping of your storyline. And here's how you do that. You put all your characters in a circle on a page, and then you draw arrows between characters who have changed one another. Now, if you don't end up with a lot of arrows between characters, that's a sign that you're not doing enough emotional work between characters in your novel. And you should also look at any characters that don't have lines drawn between them and think, all right, is there some sort of influence that they should be having on one another? Most importantly, make sure that the main character in your book, if there's a singular main character, has a lot of lines, both drawn away from him, he's impacting others or she's impacting others, and lines drawn toward him or her. They are being impacted by other main characters in the novel. And the fifth strategy when making your readers feel emotion is to risk melodrama. There's always a tension when you're writing fiction where you want dramatic events in your storyline, but you don't want to veer over into melodrama, which is like cheesy, over-the-top sort of dramatic events. And you need to figure out which way you lean towards. If you understand you lean toward melodrama, then maybe you need to dial it back a little bit. And if you tend to avoid melodrama too much, then maybe you need to pump up the emotions in your book. There's this great movie by Casey McKinnon called Candles on Bay Street. Dee Dee returns to her hometown and starts up a candle making business, but reveals that she's going to die soon. Her friend Sam, who had a crush on her when she was young, is a veterinarian and has access to drugs that can end her life, so they get together and decide to have sort of a euthanasia party. In that moment, in that night, as they're preparing to end her life, the entire town comes out holding aloft the candles that she sold to them. It's such a wonderful tribute to her and the impact that she made on these people. Now, you could argue that, oh, that's melodramatic, oh, that's a little too cheesy, but it's also very emotionally moving. I think you need to risk the melodramatic in order to make sure that you're getting the reader to feel something. Remember, there is just as much risk in your book from not going for that emotional moment, because then the reader's gonna finish the book and be like, like whatever, it was okay. Take the emotional risk in your book, take it. I want to end on this one essential quote from Maass. The most important work you do in writing your novel is the work you do on yourself. Do not forget that in order to be good at creating emotions on the page, you have to have a black belt in your own emotional state. What are your motivations in life? What sort of contradicting emotions do you feel? And what do you feel the strongest emotions about in life? If you have a good sense of your own emotional title pools and a good sense of your own emotional journey, whether through journaling or through talking with a therapist, I think you're going to be much better equipped to create those emotional journeys of your characters.